Today's world is facing big challenges. Using technology to make our communities smarter, safer, more efficient, equitable, and sustainable is no easy task. And for the pioneering visionaries that have taken on this challenge, we salute you. Welcome to Conversations with Smart City Pioneers, where we sit down with the best and brightest minds from around the globe, sharing how they are leading the smart city digital transformation revolution.
Good morning, everyone. Herb C. with Pioneer Partners. We're here for another segment of Smart City Pioneers. We're having a conversation this morning with Mike Grigsby, who's a digital transformation and smart city expert. Mike, welcome to our program today.
Herb, good morning. Thanks for having me.
No, absolutely. We're so excited to talk to you, especially, Mike, given your incredible background. I mean, I know that when I get guests on the show here, there's a lot of expertise. But your expertise is not only really deep, but it's very wide and it's multifaceted. So I'm really excited to have you on here. And so thank you. With that, Mike, we're going to go ahead and just dive right in. So one of the things when we had these conversations with Smart City Pioneers, and you've been on the front lines for quite a while, take us through a little bit of your background, what you've done, the organizations you've worked with, some of the projects. Let's first start by just talking a little bit about your experience and expertise, because I think it's fascinating.
I definitely have a broad background. For the last 10 years, I've served as a CIO for 3 different public sector agencies. I've been with a public safety organization. I've been with a public transportation organization, and most recently with a municipal organization. Having the opportunity to sit in that CIO role allows me to look very broadly across all the organizations, not only internally, but also externally, as each one of those address and affect a lot of different things going on within their respective communities. So it's given me the opportunity to see how things play out how technology affects the organization, but also how the organization affects or interacts with technology. And I would say probably going back as far as 2009, I really started understanding this thing as it started to kind of emerge, called smart cities. And it was interesting. I was with a public safety agency at the time, and it did not seem like the two would go together. How does public safety play into smart cities? But as one you can't have a safe smart city without a safe city. And so really looking at that and understanding and kind of following this thread of this thing called digital transformation. I know probably many of the people in your audience have heard that term before, but I think the convergence between digital transformation and smart cities is one that we really need to be paying attention to.
So Mike, I'm going to wind you back a little bit. So when you say public safety, let's be really specific here, because I think some of your reservoir of expertise and experience really has been shaped by being on the front lines and really in some very specific roles. So when you say public safety, because you were in law enforcement for a number of years, is that correct?
That's correct.
So were you you were a police officer and also a CIO, not at the same time though, is that correct?
Not at the same time.
Okay.
So I actually was a CIO for a private industry, mortgage banking. Left that to become a police officer. It was my childhood dream. I was 35 years old and decided to become a police officer. And I thought I had left the technology world behind, never to see it again, and was going to dive into this thing called law enforcement. About 3 years into my career, someone found out what was in my background, and that put me onto a track to look at technology within public safety. And to be quite honest, I didn't know that that field was as burgeoning as it was. And it was at an opportune time, because that time that I took over as CIO for, I actually was the police officer for the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. And that was the same time that Kansas City was making its entrance into this thing called smart cities. And so just the meeting of those two things was an opportune time. And it really allowed me to kind of, I kind of begged, borrowed, and cajoled to get a seat at the table for all those smart city discussions.
Well, I was going to say the ability to weave in interactions as a police officer with a technology expertise, I mean, is already an incredible beginning. So we're going to unpack that a little bit in just a moment. And then you said you went to a transportation agency. Tell me a little bit about that organization and what was your role there? Because again, transportation mobility in every modern city or even small communities is the lifeblood of community. If you can't move about, if you can't get to and from work, school, you know, if you're in California, those poor people get stuck, you know, on the 405 and, you know, an hour or two of traffic going to and from every day. To be able to move about a city is incredibly important. Tell me a little bit about that so the viewer here can understand that.
Certainly. I'll just go on record and say that, you know, your transportation network, your transportation system within any urban community, it's the central nervous system. If you cannot move people in, out, and through cities, you're going to be super challenged to provide a quality citizen experience. And your transportation network, not just public transportation, right, but your entire transportation network, it's the central nervous system of any community. I left the police department and then took over the CIO role for the Kansas City Area Transportation Authority. So it's not just public transportation, but they are a transportation authority, a bi-state region, 121 municipalities, multiple counties, and so forth. And so I love the dynamics of that because I had to work across multiple states. I had to work across multiple counties. I had to work across multiple government administrations and the needs. And I say but you know, the entire team did. And so this was the leadership that was there in the KCATA at the time was incredibly visionary, was looking to capitalize on the changes that were happening in transportation, right? Transportation had historically, and I won't go into this too much, but transportation had historically been built around job centers and work centers and residential centers. Well, over the course of time, all of that changed and all of that kind of got blown out of the water. And the leadership there at KCATA sought to find ways to adapt to those changing dynamics. And kudos. One, I'm grateful for having the opportunity to come in and be a part of that leadership team. But kudos to the senior leadership there and the direction that they took. It was cutting edge and risky. We had a lot of successful failures. Some things we tried, we experimented, and didn't go as we wanted to, but we got a lot of lessons from that and changed a lot of things within the city and affected a lot of people's lives.
Well, the successful failures has certainly been part of the roadmap of smart cities in my experience over the course of the last decade plus, because there's a lot of things. Along the way, I think you had to stop off, and I know you had more things. You had to stop off at a large technology company too, which kind of rounded out some experience before you landed in your last role. Tell me a little bit about that very briefly, and then let's talk about big picture of the last role, and then I'm going to start hitting you with some hard questions here.
So you're right. In 2018, I left public sector and went into the private sector to capitalize on the experience that I had in the smart city space. From 2012 to 2018, Kansas City had really positioned itself in a leadership and certainly kind of a one to pay attention to, a city to pay attention to in the smart city space. And that gave me an opportunity to be on a national and international platform and just right time, right place, right things, capitalize on that. I went to work for a global technology company. I went to work for Cisco Systems. And I was a member of their global smart cities, smart and connected communities team is what they called it. But, you know, the entire team was building smart city solutions and delivering smart city solutions across the entire globe. And so having the opportunity to not only gain the insight from Kansas City, but then going in and watching and observing and doing some deep research into what was happening in municipalities and communities across the globe. I can't highlight enough the advantage that it's had for me.
Well, That's again, public sector, private sector, a lot of things. So it sounds like the last role, you wove a lot of that stuff together because again, you now have seen all this in the lens. And so let's now start working into maybe a conversation. Tell me a little bit about your last role, and especially tell me a little bit about what are some of the lessons that you learned there. And you know, even though one thing we always tell folks, smart cities really isn't about technology, it's about people. But let's focus on the technology first, because I know there's some people questions I want to ask you about as well, given your expertise. But tell me about your last role in the holistic piece, and then tell me some of the lessons learned. Are there any technology assets that you think are super useful? Are there, you know, how did you approach it? Just tell me about that.
So my last role, I served as the CIO for the city of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And for those that aren't familiar with the city, it's the largest city in the state of South Dakota. It has been on a growth trajectory for the last 10 years, and certainly over the last, the last 4 years, or I guess 6 years now. Under this current administration, I came in and was able, as you mentioned, was able to bring a lot of that background, a lot of that experience to bear for the city. And one of the things that really interested me about stepping into that role. So again, I was in the private sector, playing on a global team and getting to see things literally across the world. I was not witnessing the same kind of adaptation and rate of adoption for smart city strategies or smart city solutions in the U.S. that I was seeing overseas. Mm-hmm. And there are so many different dynamics that were involved in that. And one of the things that I really wanted to do was to step back out of that and see if there was an opportunity, see if there was a way to create a replicable model that cities could follow. And certainly one, you know, just within my peer network and sharing that information back and forth, there were a lot of things, a lot of great things going on in the city of Sioux Falls. And so that's what initially attracted me. What I think, to your point about the technology specifics, I think what was interesting is as I stepped in, the city was very, very far forward in its thinking about technology. Not necessarily the adaptation of it, but its thinking and conceptual levels of it. And that was very, very good. What we needed to do was get some basics, get some fundamentals done, foundational projects, things related to collaboration and communication, things related to website and communications, things related to office productivity and so forth. So getting those in first was going to be that foundational layer, and then we could build, smart lighting. Where projects we're looking at smart lighting, smart parking. Eventually, the public works team was very, very future forward and looking at some of the development that they were doing around water access and water technologies and things like that. And I mean, tremendous kudos to the teams that were already in place. I got to come in and literally just kind of push a couple of things over the edge and get them moving and gain some momentum.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's I know that you said parking, water, lighting; those are all important components. I know that the network sometimes people overlook, especially in this day and age that we're living in. It's August of 2022. We've got the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act that's investing a significant amount of capital for cities and broadband infrastructure. The lifeblood of communications within a city, just like the lifeblood of a city's mobility. You also have to move, information, not just people, because people and information go hand in hand. And so the ability to put all that together is incredibly important. What are some of the challenges that you all had? Because again, if you think about this, if somebody is undergoing a project, a digital transformation project, especially post-COVID, everyone was confronted with the reality of having to do things overnight in some cases. And for those that are not familiar with some of the challenges, what are some of the things that people could avoid? So if you're thinking about things that you have to overcome, and you can draw on your experience from, the CIO, from PD, from transportation mobility, from Cisco, or anywhere else you want to come, what are some of the top challenges and things that you may want to think about that folks could have to improve the success of their projects. And then I'm going to talk to you, and I want to ask you a people question, because there's something that's burning in my mind that I've seen, and I want to see if you can help me, unpack this.
Yeah. I would love to say that there are some things that you can avoid. But I think that would be the equivalent of saying you can avoid your teenage years and go straight from being a young person to an adult, right?
Sure.
I think in many respects, there's a lot of the things the transitions that cities in particular, townships, counties, states, the federal, definitely within the public sector, there are things, those transitions that they're going through that they have to navigate through, they have to go through. But I think the bigger posturing or the bigger position on this is, how do you prepare yourself to go through that?
Okay.
One of the things that Kansas City, I used to say this a lot and say it comically, is that I would love to tell everybody that we were just super smart and were able to figure all this stuff out that we got done. The reality is we were really, really lucky and had some very fortunate mistakes that we were able to capitalize on, right? But now that other cities have gone through this, if you are a city, if you are an organization that is embarking on this now, I cannot emphasize enough to pay attention to the learning lessons from other cities, pay attention to what they've done, and then get to know your organization extremely well. Who are the people? Who are the process? What are the cultures that are going on inside your organization? Because those things will have a greater effect than any technology initiative that you're putting into place. So, those were things that I have to say, just tremendous benefit to Mayor Paul Tenhaken of Sioux Falls, who had already begun leading a cultural change within the city before I got there, and allowed me to step in and take a very different, just a different position with my team, with the administrative team, the executive team, and so forth, and allowed us to have some really, really necessary and good conversations.
So I heard you say, if I heard you correctly, people and process and culture.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because the success of a city outwardly facing, when you install technology, and it's not tech for tech's sake, it's tech for the impact to affect people. But I'm hearing you say, if you kind of flip that lens around, you really got to look at the people to be able to, digest, technology or the process, which process isn't just machinery. People are responsible for process and implementing process, and the byproduct of even automation affects people. Tell me a little bit more. Are there some examples that you might have that you can kind of help us understand a little bit more in depth of this people, process, and culture?
I think one example that stands out is from certainly my last role with the city of Sioux Falls is we had identified some key initiatives, some technology key initiatives. So, my department oversaw technology, communications, geographic information systems, which we called civic analytics. And so bringing those three teams together, which were not inherently, joined together, but bringing them together to look holistically at a lot of these technology initiatives. One of the things that I did beginning in 2022 was I took an entire quarter. So the first 3 months of this year, I had the team just think about how they think about all of the projects that we're going. It's easy and often typical to have, production meetings or project meetings where we're talking about status, where we're talking about deliverables, where we're talking about timelines, where we're talking about budget and things along those lines. I took an entire quarter. So every other week we got together as an entire, it was a leadership team plus key influencers. We got together and we spent 2 hours just talking about how we think about these projects, how they're going to affect, what is it going to look like, how are people going to interact with these things and so forth. And so what came out of that was I had an entire team that could finish each other's sentences, that had adopted the concept, not just the implementation value, but the concept of what this is going to do and how this was going to affect and interact, and people were going to interact with these things. And we began looking at what are the other processes that need to change? Who else needs to be at the table? What are the other internal cultures that will potentially, stymie these things and so forth? So that's the one that stands out the most is being able to think about how you think about things.
That's interesting. Sometimes we become very comfortable with the familiarity that we have in our jobs and the roles that we play, that we just assume the way we're thinking about it and seeing something is the right way. And not that it's wrong, but there's always different complexions based on the time that you're living in, the conditions that may exist for a project. Could be budgeting, could be the needs of the city, could be a problem that's erupted. So that's interesting. So thinking about the way we think about things. Okay.
Herb, if I can just real quick inject, the other thing that allowed us to do was to overcome some of the inertia with change, right? Inertia is one of those things that has to, this is the enemy of momentum, right? And so people's day jobs are always going to threaten the new thing, the new project, the new implementation, right? And if you spend the time thinking about how you think about this, thinking about how you're going to interact with it, thinking about how it's going to affect you, thinking how it's going to affect other people, it allows you to get that ball moving slowly and overcome some of that inertia that's at the beginning of almost every project. And you now have something, you've kind of put currency in the bank that you can go back and draw from and say, oh, remember when we talked about this? Okay, that's what we're moving towards. Remember these things, remember these benefits and so forth. So I wanted to say that was a crucial point too that came up.
Well, I think inertia is everything. Being able to not only seize the initiative, it's important to have movement. And if you can go quick, that's great, but it's important to have sustainable. I know that in my work and working with cities across the country, being able to have continued signs of progress keeps people on board. It instills confidence. It gets people excited. And by the way, it takes a while to sometimes see everything. And so you can't see it all overnight. But if you stop and put it down, we're off to the next thing. We're very distractible. Our jobs require us to be multitasking at all times, which isn't always good for the best thoughts that can come out. So you're right. Okay. Any other thoughts again on people, process, and culture? What other examples might you have, or some advice to folks that are undergoing these digital transformation projects?
I think there's a notion here too of looking at I don't know, I'll just call it the internal operating system of an organization, right? And this is something that I know that we had great conversations with the executive team at the city, and we began looking at what makes up that operating system. And it's super easy. I won't take time to unpack it, but it's super easy to find an illustration that says, when you look at a computer system, here's all your top level applications, your Microsoft Word or your browser or your accounting software or something like that, right? But that's not what runs the computer. That's just what allows you to leverage the computing power, right? And it does it through this application. But there's a component underneath that is the operating system. That's running all the calculations and doing all the compute power. And you look at an organization, and for the most part, I'm sure there's different dynamics out there, but for the most part, nowadays you have your finance team, you have your personnel team or your HR team, and then you have technology. You can talk about your administrative team. That's absolutely a component of that, but that's top level. But within the operating system, you have your finance, you have your personnel, and then you have your technology. And those three, as kind of a three-legged stool, serve the rest of those top-level applications, which for a city could be your public safety, your public works, your library, your parks and rec, your public health. All of those are top-level applications that don't run the city, but allow your citizens to interact fully and leverage the quote-unquote compute power of a city. So I say all that to say this, is that if you understand how that operating system works, and this is one of the things that we were doing at Sioux Falls, is really helping to kind of help them serve those others better. That changed our budget process. That changed our hiring process. or started to change our hiring processes, started to change the way everybody interacted with technology. And I think the biggest thing is that it allowed the organization to take organizational ownership of technology initiatives. It wasn't just an IT thing, right? And that's crucial for any organization.
That's a great point. If you don't have fuel in the tank from finance, if you don't have a driver in the vehicle, if you don't have a vehicle that's tuned in, doesn't matter what department's trying to get to where it's going to go. If you don't have the foundation of the chassis and, fuel to, get you there, it's just not going to happen. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Any other last ideas within this thread? This is great because, again, the people piece, and really you can buy the technology, you can read the owner's manual, you can install it, but if you don't have the people behind it, it's not going to get, at the very least, its fullest maximum potential and impact, or in some cases won't even work at all. Tell me a little bit more. Any other pieces within this?
I think there was the other thing that I started looking at, and this had to deal with the personnel management, right? Anytime that you have multiple initiatives going on, you said it just a little while ago, we're trying to multitask and get a lot of things done, which really doesn't work, right? And as you start to look at all of the, you look at who your leadership team is, right? These are people who are in positions of authority. You're a manager, a supervisor, a director, whatever it is. But then you have key influencers within your organization, right? They may not have positional title, but they are absolutely at the table, and they're the ones typically that are carrying the ball, help you carry the ball across the finish line. When you start to look at, when you're doing multiple initiatives and you start to see the same people sitting in those meetings, you begin to realize that there's not enough hours in the day. There's not enough bandwidth. There's not enough to get these projects done. And as I mentioned before, they still have their day job, right? There's still that report that has to get run at 3 p.m. every Tuesday, or there's still that deliverable that they're having to be accountable to. So one of the things I started looking at was what I have called, and this is my working title, right? Quote unquote, my working title. But I've called it my SME demand curve, or my subject matter expert demand curve.
Subject matter expert demand curve. Okay. I can feel a chart or a graph or something coming out of this. So this is good.
I think there's math involved in this. I'll have to explore it further. But if you are a domain expert, there is a demand placed on you. We call this a job description, right? But the minute you're able to start your job description, or the minute you're fulfilling your job description, we now ask you, hey, Herb, what else can you do? Hey, this was good, but now you can do this. And so we watch this demand curve go on. We haven't changed the job description, but the demand curve continues to go up. But there's always a point up there that you hit a ceiling. There's so many hours in a day and so forth. So one of the things that I began looking at was asking the management team to begin identifying what I'll call inflection point. There's that moment that we can take a certain skill set of Herb as a domain expert and commoditize that and make that kind of a cover charge, kind of table stakes for everybody within the organization. It could be a process, it could be a skill, it could be whatever it is, right? Perfect example, as we were beginning to look at the city was beginning to look at implementing a new website. Content creation or content management was something that had been relegated to the communications team, okay? Well, in today's day and age, the amount of content that needs to be managed, or the amount of content that is being created, cannot be become the responsibility of just one team. Mm-hmm. So how do we begin, quote unquote, commoditizing this skill set or this process of content creation? Again, I don't have time to unpack all that, but understanding that your key influencers, your domain experts, are getting pulled into all of these multiple projects. You have to find a way to help them offload some of those low level skill sets for them, things that have become kind of rote and kind of automatic for them, so that you can continue to maximize their expertise in their respective domain. That makes it exciting for them. It helps them stay engaged, and it now raises the level of aptitude, the level of efficiency, the level of skill set for everybody within the organization. And kind of, to the old adage, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So now everybody comes along, as opposed to that just being a skill relegated to that particular team.
It sounds like It's an ongoing process.
It is.
You start accumulating things along the way. You're building really an organizational intelligence and capability. And if I were to even quote my inner Malcolm Gladwell, that 10,000 hours, we should embrace whenever we have somebody with that said 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 hours, and they need to continue to develop it because they're going to see things that we don't. So I think you make a very good point, particularly in the day and age of workforce is at a premium. There's not enough talent and skills, even though you can find people to work remotely and bring in consultants, but really being able to build a core team that can be augmented by people, make sure that they're engaged, they're happy, and they're really producing their maximum value, which frankly makes them happy too. So
the side note to that too is the effect that it has on the rest of the team, right? I'll just take a generic supervisor, right? If you're the supervisor of a domain expert, part of your responsibility now is to help identify when those inflection points occur, right? And to steer, to purposely and intentionally steer towards them to help your domain expert offload that. Well, now your supervisor is engaged in a very different way with their team member. This isn't just about, hey, as a supervisor, I'm just an extra worker who's been here with tenure, or I just happen to know where all the bodies are buried, or I'm going to write your annual eval, right? Now you are engaged at a very different way that has you thinking very differently about what your team is delivering. So this level of engagement really, really is a byproduct of that SME demand curve, whatever we'll eventually call it.
Well, I'm going to be looking for a blog post or a chart or maybe a T-shirt or something.
I'll put that out this week.
Oh, perfect. Mike, one last question I always like to ask our guests as we're wrapping up here. Again, technology really is helping shape the future, but arguably the future is also shaping the technology. What do you see for the future of either cities or technology or people, or the amalgamation really of all three? What do you see for the near-term future? What's the opportunity that we've got to get right now to really be able to get smart cities and digital transformation to be a continued success and not make it just a buzzword that goes away?
Yeah, I think smart cities, the quote unquote term, smart cities really expose the latent demand for citizen experience and citizen engagement. I think that was one of the things that happened. I think what COVID did was it exposed the reality that this is here to stay. This isn't a fad. There is no going back to normal. This is the new normal, however you want to couch that. The game has changed, and cities, government, public sector has to completely reinvent itself to adapt to the game. That's been on the docket for a long time, and now now's the moment that we really have to embrace this. And to be quite frank, not many, especially in the public sector, and this isn't, I don't mean this as a finger pointing thing, but many within the public sector organization have not adequately prepared their organizations for this. Change of administration, just the way the models have been built and so forth, just didn't facilitate that. But now is the time that it has to happen. I love the old saying, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The next best time is right now, right? So this is the time to do that. The other thing is, I think smart cities, and I'll go ahead and kind of loop in digital transformation. These are two terms that are going around. Maybe they're synonymous, maybe not, but I'm gonna loop them together and say that those two things have revealed that everything really does touch everything else, right? The silos that have to be broken down in order to facilitate a true citizen experience, a holistic citizen experience, from public works to public safety to public libraries to public health. It's the same citizen. We have to figure out ways to get this. That points to data, right? So the data is something that cities have to get very, very comfortable working with. There's a lot of leaders out there, cities that I can name, but that are doing very, very good things within data. But that needs to be pushed further down into virtually every municipality, township, county, state, and so forth. Use data intentionally to drive your decisions. Don't just use it as the kind of, like you said, use it as the buzzword. And the last thing that I'll say is the speed and rate of technology adoption. We can look at cameras. We can look at smart lighting. We can look at smart parking, smart water. I'll just dive into cameras for a moment, cameras and lighting, because I think those are two that many cities are working on right now. If you don't have a solid networking backbone to push and transport all of that, I said many years ago, I said, data is the new oil, right? Mm-hmm. But if you strike oil in your backyard and you don't have a way to transport it and you don't have a way to refine it, all you have is a black puddle, right? So you have got to have a good, solid, secure network to transport all of your data. The other thing is you've got to have a way to refine it. So your dashboarding, your visualization, all of those things are critical so that people don't feel like they need a PhD or to be a subject matter expert into this to get the most meaningful insights from it. So I know that's a lot in kind of a short, statement, but from the standpoint of, everything really does touch everything else. The scope and rate of change right now from a technology standpoint is huge. And the last thing that I'll say is that stop thinking, I'm saying this as kind of a command, stop thinking of digital as technology. The digital transformation is transforming your entire organization. It's not just the IT department. IT cannot own this by themselves. You've got to get everybody involved. You've got to bring all of your leaders to the table, from finance to personnel to public works to everybody involved. You've got to get everybody at the table, and it requires organizational ownership.
That's great advice. That's phenomenal. Well, Mike, thank you so much for your time. Again, Mike Grigsby, I'm going to put the label of Smart City and Digital Transformation Expert with public safety, transportation mobility, private, public sector backgrounds and expertise, and then obviously a holistic view that also includes people, process, and culture. So, Mike, thanks so much for joining us today. Again, as always, I always learn a lot whenever we have conversations with smart city pioneers like yourself. And stay tuned for the next episode. We appreciate you all tuning in, and we'll see you for the next time around. Thanks, Mike.
Herb, thanks for having me.